All right guys, day 2 on taking the engine out of the car. I've done a few things off camera just to save time and boredom for you. I've gone ahead and put the car up on jack stands and drained the coolant and the oil out of the vehicle. And I'll show you where to do that. It's a little more complicated on this. Not really complicated, just takes a lot more time because you drain the oil out of the engine, out of the oil pan. And then, at least on the manual cars, you have 2 oil coolers in the front. You have one on the left side and one on the right side. So you've got to unhook the oil line hoses out of those coolers and drain them out of those. And then on the coolant side, not only do you have to drain coolant out of the radiator, there's a plug on the side of the block for you to remove coolant from the block itself as well, because you want all of that fluid gone when you start pulling the engine out. The other things that I've done is take off some of the coolant hoses and then the windshield washer reservoir to get that out of the way, make more room. Other than that, everything's where we had it before. So let me show you where the coolant lines are, as well as the oil drain from the oil coolers in the front and the coolant plug on the side of the engine block. All right, so right here you can see it's a Phillips head screw, and all you've got to do is unscrew that and remove the coolant from the radiator. Do that first, and then over here on the side of the block, you'll see there's a bracket that's normally bolted right here. You don't have to remove this to drain the coolant. I did, because when we're pulling the motor, we're going to have all this unhooked anyway, so I went ahead and cleared up some space. So once I pulled this out of the way, this right here is your plug on the side of the motor to go ahead and remove coolant. It's a 12mm plug, and there's plenty of coolant in there when you pull that plug. So make sure you have a good pan with plenty of space in there to allow that to drain all the coolant out, even after you've drained the radiator and most of the hoses. And then of course you've got your oil pan plug on the other side, and then you've got your oil coolers over here. Now the oil cooler, there's a couple ways that you can do this. For me, the easiest way was to just remove these massive banjo bolts right here. Make sure you hold on to the copper washers. You really should use new ones, but if you can't get a hold of new ones, reuse the old ones. I'm not reusing the old oil coolers, so all of this is going to come out anyway. But there's these quick disconnect clips that you can use as well. You pull these clips out, and then these soft hoses will pull out from the hard lines, and you can just leave those mounted. So you have that option as well to pull those out. I just went ahead and removed these. Now on automatic cars, you only have one oil cooler. On manual cars, you have one on this side and one on the right side. And so it's the same on both sides. You've got the quick disconnect pins, or you've got the banjo bolts. So I just went ahead and did this and have just let it drain here for a little while. All right, like I said, the other things that I've done is remove the overflow for the coolant. I've removed all of the coolant hoses that go to the radiator, the hoses that go to the heater core through the firewall there, and then some of the other hoses that had run up to the throttle body. So what we're going to do now, I looked online to see why the intake manifold was still there. There's one more bolt down here on this side. So total of 2 bolts down here, 2 bolts right here, and then over here you've got 3 bolts. So you've got one over here on this side, here, and here. And then you should be able to remove this intake manifold. So that's what we're going to do now. We're going to remove that one other bolt, and then we're just going to keep getting all this stuff out of the way. Now if you're just removing the RX8 engine and you're going to be replacing it with a rebuilt one or a new one or whatever, you don't have to take out the windshield washer fluid reservoir. You don't have to take out the coolant overflow, and you really don't have to remove all the lines from the vehicle. You just got to get them out of the way for the motor to be able to come out. It doesn't take that much time to just go ahead and pull all of them. You get more space to work in, and it just allows you to get all the old coolant out for when you put in the new motor. But all this stuff is coming out, so I'm just removing anything that's in the way. But you don't have to get those out of the way in order to pull the motor if you're keeping the same motor. So once we have this upper intake manifold off, we're also going to come down here and take off the AC compressor, and we'll be able to get to that from the side with the fender well linings and everything out. And then we'll get to the motor mounts and get underneath, remove the drive shaft. So let's get to it. All right, well, it looks like someone's done some pretty poor electrical work over here, just twisted some wires around. Could be because of some of the engine issues, but you've got 3 plugs back here. Go ahead and remove those. And then you've got vacuum lines. Now keep track of where these vacuum lines go for these solenoids if you're going to be replacing it with another rotary engine. All right, and then this vacuum line is just held on with a blue clip. You pop that off and this quick disconnect slides right off. So there's your upper intake manifold. All right, so now that we have the upper intake off, or at least the one piece of the upper intake off, we're going to remove the lower plastic piece of the upper intake manifold, and it's just 4 more bolts that go right here. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do to start removing this AC compressor is reduce the tension on the belt here. So what we're going to do, you loosen here, and that basically unlocks it on the tensioner, and then this is your adjustment screw. So then you just unwind that to drop this pulley down, and that'll loosen your belt. Pull that off, and then we'll be able to get to the compressor bolts from the side and the wheel well. All right, before we jump down to take the AC compressor off, and right now we're just going to lay the AC compressor to the side. It's still hooked up to all these lines, but if you're pulling the motor out to just swap your rotary, it's a good idea to just leave the air conditioning if you're keeping it, because that way you don't have to empty the lines and all that stuff, get it vacuumed out and then repressurized with refrigerant once you put the new motor in. So if you kind of hold the lines out of the way and disconnect the AC compressor, you can get it out to the side so you can pull the whole motor out. When you put the new motor in, you just bolt your AC compressor back up, so then you don't have to do anything with the AC. This one's coming out, so we're going to remove it, but right now we're just going to put it to the side so we can get it out of the way and pull the motor out. But before we do that, we're going to come right here just to these 3 connections to the front fuse box to the engine harness, so that way we can pull the whole motor out with the engine harness here. All right, so now all that's out of the way, coil brackets out of the way. I'm going to go ahead and remove these top 2 bolts, and then we'll get underneath to remove the bottom bolts. All right, so right here are the 2 lower bolts of the AC compressor. You've got the rear one and the front one. Now, what I found to be the easiest for me, it may be different for you, but this front bolt right here, to just get at it from underneath the car with a wrench, with a box end wrench. Okay, so for the rear bolt there, what I've found is if you use a long extension like this with a swivel on the end, you can just get in from the side and break it loose from here. This is hard to do with one hand, but and then just remove that right there. But once we have these two bottom bolts out, the whole AC compressor should pull away from the motor, and then we'll get to those motor mounts. All right, so now we have the compressor unhooked. Got this pulled up out of the way. I've also pulled off the spark plug wires. And so then the last thing we're gonna do up here for right now is go ahead and get the rest of this wiring harness unhooked from up here. And we'll get down to the motor mounts. But this will allow us to kind of fold it up out of the way, just give us more access. But what you would normally do is, I'm not worried about that. That's coming out of the car anyway for me. Unplug it from here, and then we're gonna pop this top off, disconnect the wire right here, and then this wire right here that should run down to the starter, I believe. We're gonna disconnect from right here, and obviously you can see mine is quite corroded, so I'll probably have to do some scraping or even cutting. But once you disconnect those things, the engine part of this harness right here will just be able to sit right on top of the motor. All right, so I jumped the gun a little bit saying we were gonna go ahead and take the motor mounts off. I'm gonna get underneath the car here and start removing some of these parts. So the starter I'm gonna take off to just get this out of the way. And then take off the exhaust. But we're gonna go ahead and remove this middle section of exhaust, which you'll need to do if you're going to be pulling the motor. And then while I'm at it, since it's gonna be disconnected right there, I'm gonna go ahead and pull off the rest of the exhaust system. Once this is all off and the starter is out, then we're gonna drain the transmission fluid and support the transmission with a jack, and then start taking off the drive shaft and then this PPF or PPT, whatever they call it. That's basically reinforcement for the whole drive line. So we'll pull this off the drive shaft, and then we'll get to the motor mounts after that. To remove the starter, you got this bolt here, and it looks like one other one right above it. Disconnect the electrical lines going to the harness, and then just pull those two bolts and the starter should come out. All right, there's the starter. Okay, as you can see, the exhaust is now out, or at least this middle section is. I'll be removing the rear part here in a little bit, but if you're gonna just remove the engine, this is the only part that you have to unhook. You don't have to, remove the full exhaust like we're doing. So now that we got the starter out, we've got this middle section exhaust out, I'm gonna go ahead and drain the transmission fluid. This should be the drain right here. So we're gonna go ahead and pull that out and let that drain. And while that's draining, we'll go ahead and start removing the rest of the exhaust system. So with the exhaust housings off on the car, you can see the exhaust hangers now. So you've got two on each side of the muffler, and then this grounding strap. So the same on this side, minus the grounding strap. But the easiest thing to do, take some silicone and spray inside these exhaust hangers. And then once you do that, get a pry bar or a crowbar, and then you're able to pry those off. It's a lot easier though if you go ahead and spray some of the silicone inside the slot that you're trying to slide it out of. But once you have those sprayed, start prying away, and then that's the only thing holding this rear exhaust up. But go ahead and take the grounding strap off first, and then start taking all those off, and you'll be able to drop the whole catback system. So apparently the camera died in the middle of taking all this off. I'm not sure exactly how much it recorded, but we've got the catback off now. And if you haven't felt one of these, they weigh an absolute ton. So if you can get this off your car and go with like an aftermarket exhaust, I'm sure aftermarket ones weigh a little bit less than this. What I'm going to end up doing is running a single pipe back from the motor, probably a 3-inch pipe, and going somewhere out the middle of the back bumper. We'll build a diffuser and something there, but that way I have one muffler that's probably about 25 pounds lighter than this whole setup, so that'll be good weight reduction in the back. So with the exhaust out of the way, we can start to see the drive shaft area with the driveline support here. So we'll take off this cover, which looks like it's just 4 14mm bolts. So we'll take those off, and that should expose the drive shaft, and then we can see exactly what we need to take off to get this off. All right, so there you go, it's off, and now we can see the drive shaft. All right, so there's 5 done so far. There's actually 5 in the back, so it's a total of 9. There are 8 nuts and 1 bolt in the back. But the top ones are going to require a deep socket and an extension, and I don't have that, so I'm going to have to go grab some of that from the store. All right, so I got the socket that I needed, which is a deep 21mm, and so that allowed me to get these 2 back here, and then the 2 nuts on the transmission that were higher up. I also had to get a 1/2-inch extension, but once I did that, I went ahead and pulled that driveline brace down off camera, and just pulled that off. So we've got that off. We've got the transmission already drained. So now, in order to disconnect the whole assembly, all we've got to do is take off the 4 bolts for the drive shaft here on the pinion. So let me go ahead and remove these. All right, so with all the bolts out, all we're gonna do is slide it forward just a little bit. The slip yoke and the transmission will slide up in, and then we'll be able to set this down and pull it out of the transmission. Okay, so now that the drive shaft is unhooked, there's only a couple things that we have left before we are able to get the transmission out. One of those is to remove the slave cylinder from the transmission right here. You can see there's 2 12mm nuts or bolts that are right into the transmission bell housing. Just remove those, and then down here, right here, if you can see, that is another 12mm that's just holding the bracket right here up against the transmission. And so once we have the slave cylinder out, we can pop that out of the way and then move the line away, and it'll just be out to the side, just like the AC compressor when we pull the whole assembly out. And if you're just doing like a stock replacement, that's the easiest way to go. You don't have to drain anything. If you're, removing everything and gutting it all out, you can just go ahead and open up the lines and drain it all, which I'll do eventually. I'm not going to do that right now. But just pull that away from the transmission and it'll be out to the side. And then the other thing is just this cross brace that runs across here. It bolts up to the front subframe right here, and then to the chassis. So we're going to go ahead and take this out. That way we can tilt the engine and transmission down more while we're pulling it out. It'll just make it a lot easier to get that thing up and out of here. Okay, so now that we have the cross member, the subframe brace taken out, what we're going to do is start working on the motor mounts now. From up top, you can see them pretty well. There's one bolt on top of each side, and then there's a couple bolts bolting them down to the subframe, and they've got this little lip that basically, once you take this bolt out, you can lift it up just enough where you can pull these up from the subframe and out to the side, I believe. I might take them out like that, or I may just unbolt them from the motor itself. I don't know, whichever's easier. I'm going to go ahead and probably take the whole motor mount off this side of the motor, because there's plenty of room to get to the bolts. It'll just make it a lot easier to pull it up and out. So I'll probably just take this one off, leave this one attached to the motor, but unhook it from the subframe, and then we can pull it kind of over here and up out of the engine bay. And then the only other thing that we have connected, can't really see it with the AC compressor in the way, but these two lines right here are your oil lines that go down to the oil cooler, and we've already unhooked them from the oil coolers up front. But I'm going to take this line off from the engine to get that out of the way, and then this line right here runs over here and then down to one of the quick disconnects like I was talking about when we removed them from the oil cooler. So I'm going to unhook this and pull the soft line off from here, and then we'll just remove all the other soft lines from the chassis later on. But when you're removing the engine, it's easiest to take off the one line right there at the block. The other one runs along here and then hooks onto the oil filter housing. So if you're just swapping out your motor, it's easier to leave that on and just unhook the soft line down here and then unhook it from the block there. So we're going to unhook those oil lines and then take off these motor mounts, and then we'll be able to hook the motor up to the hoist and pull it out. So let's get it done. All right, so here's a side view of the motor mount on the driver's side. You can see the two upper bolts there holding it onto the block, and then there's two down below, which should be pretty easy to get to. I can get to the top ones from the engine bay, and then the bottom two from underneath the car. So we should be able to get this motor mount unhooked pretty easily. Okay, a really important thing that I forgot to mention is before you start to unbolt your motor mounts from the motor itself, you need to have some kind of support system for the motor, whether that means putting a jack underneath it, or jack stands, or a stack of boards, or whatever to support it, because as soon as you start unbolting it, there's going to be nothing holding the engine up anymore. So I'm using a hoist to pull it out from the top. If you're going to drop the engine from the bottom, you can do that as well. But since I'm using the hoist, I can't really put a jack under it, because then the legs of the hoist won't be able to go under there to allow me to pull it up out if there's a jack in the way. So I've gone ahead and I've hooked up the hoist, and then I'm going to go ahead and start unbolting the motor mounts now. It's getting dark, so I don't know if it'll show it very well on film, but I'm gonna do this as fast as I can and then try and film getting the motor out of the car with the hoist. All right, well there you have it. Engine and transmission are out of the car. Hit a few snags when taking it out. So, a couple things. Let me get some lighting in here. All right, so in hindsight, I probably should have waited till tomorrow to do it in the light so you guys could get a better view of it. I haven't looked at the footage yet, but I'm sure it's terrible. Basically, I wouldn't recommend taking the transmission out with the engine. It was too much trouble trying to get it over the front support beam that's in the engine compartment. There's tons of room in the engine compartment, but unfortunately where that support beam is, having to angle it and try and get the engine lifted up over that while getting the transmission forward. I've done it in a lot of other vehicles that way. That's generally the easier way. I think that if you're going to take the engine and transmission out in this car together, the easiest way would probably be just drop the entire subframe, which I could have done, but I didn't think I would run into these kind of snags because it looked like there was so much room in the engine compartment. So I wouldn't recommend doing what I just did. I would take the engine out separately, drop the transmission, and then the engine will come straight up. It would have taken a lot less time, other than the time that it would have taken to unbolt the transmission from the engine itself. The other things that I would do is take the actual motor mounts off the engine. I took the driver's side one off, but thought that we could swing the engine over in order to get it out. But because I left the box where the ECU and the electronic steering control module sit, that motor mount kept wanting to snag on that. So in the middle of taking the whole motor out, I just took that motor mount off. It would have been easier to do that with the engine still sitting down there on either the hoist or on a jack underneath. Other than that, no problems. The AC compressor got in the way. That's another reason why I would take the engine out separately from the transmission, because there's not a lot of room to come forward with that AC compressor there if you're leaving the lines hooked up. Now, if you unhook it, that's not a problem. Other than that, we've got it out. Tomorrow, I'm gonna jump back on the car and we'll either do the sound deadening that's in the floor, take that out with some dry ice, or just start ripping everything else out of the engine compartment now that we have the engine out. Another thing that I need to do is take the differential out. And now that I have the engine and everything out, what I'm going to do is get this Mustang chassis out from under the carport, put in some more lights here, and that way we won't have any dark videos now that the sun's coming down earlier in the day. But thank you for watching. Hope this was helpful, and we'll see you next time. Bye.
Take it easy.